Report 1. I've always loved New York. The energy of the city, the lights that never go out, the constant sound of cars and people. It's a place where you never feel alone. At least that's what I thought until the night something happened. I was visiting the city for a work event, but I decided to take some time to explore alone. Walking through New York at night felt like an exciting adventure until it turned into an experience I would prefer to forget. It was a Friday, and the sun was setting when I left the hotel. The sky was tinged with orange and purple, and the streets were full of life. There was something special about New York at dusk, a blend of beauty and chaos that always fascinated me. I decided to walk to Brooklyn Bridge Park, a place I had always wanted to visit. The walk would take me about half an hour, but that was no problem. I loved watching the streets, the tall buildings, and the hurried people passing by. As I walked, the city began to change. The main streets gave way to narrower, less busy alleys. The lights in the shop windows became more spaced out, and the constant hum of the crowd started to fade away. Before I knew it, I was in a neighborhood emptier than I expected. It wasn't dangerous, but there was something unsettling about the growing silence. I passed an old building with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. In the reflection of a shop window, I thought I saw someone following me, but when I turned around, the sidewalk was empty. I shook my head, laughing at myself for being so paranoid. I kept walking, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I glanced back again, and this time I saw something that made me freeze. A figure was standing a few meters away from me. They were wearing a hood that concealed their face, but the way they stood still, arms at their sides, was disturbing. I quickened my pace, trying not to look scared. The figure began to move, following me from a distance. My heart raced, but I still tried to convince myself it was just someone going in the same direction. I reached a corner and quickly turned, hoping to lose them. When I looked back, they had vanished. I sighed in relief, but the relief didn't last long. Seconds later, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. They were quick, firm, as if someone was running in my direction. Without thinking, I started to run. The streets were almost deserted, and the streetlights seemed dimmer than before. Every time I looked back, I saw no one, but the footsteps continued. I turned into another alley, hoping to find a busier street, but I stopped dead in my tracks at something even worse. The figure was there again, standing in the middle of the path, as if they had precise information about where I was going. I was frozen for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I shouted, "What do you want?" but received no answer. The figure took a step toward me and I turned to run in the opposite direction. When I returned to the main street, I finally saw some people and felt a bit safer. But when I looked back, I realized the figure hadn't followed me. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound closer. I arrived at Brooklyn Bridge Park, but the idea of relaxing and admiring the view no longer made sense. All I wanted was to get back to the hotel. I took the busiest route I could find, but as I turned the last corner, I saw something that made me stop in the middle of the sidewalk. The figure was standing in front of my hotel, pointing directly at the entrance. I quickly entered, trying to ignore it, and went up to my room. I slammed the door shut, locked all the locks, and lay on the bed, trying to understand what had happened. I looked out the window, hoping to see it on the street, but it was gone. Everything seemed calm again. I tried to sleep, but every sound in the hotel hallway made me jump. The next morning, we left New York earlier than we had planned. To this day, I don't know who or what that figure was, but whenever I'm alone on a quiet street, I remember that night and the feeling that in New York, you are never really alone. Report 2. New York has always been the kind of place that made me feel alive. The immense buildings, the frantic pace, the people coming and going at all hours. You feel like you can disappear into the crowd, as if no one really notices you. But one night, During a recent visit, I experienced a different side of the city, a side that isn't in the postcards or tourist guides, a version of New York that I realized how easy it is to get lost, in a way you don't want. I had just left a restaurant in the Lower East Side, past 10 p.m. It was a summer night, and the heat of the day still lingered in the air. My options were to take a taxi or walk to the subway. I chose to walk, thinking a 15-minute stroll through the city would be relaxing. The streets were quiet, which was unusual, but I enjoyed the stillness. The streetlights faintly illuminated the sidewalks, and the distant sound of honking created an oddly calm soundtrack. As I moved forward, I noticed that the streets were becoming increasingly empty. The shops were closed, and the few people passing by hurried along, looking straight ahead as if avoiding something. I walked a few more blocks until I turned onto a street that seemed even more deserted. The streetlights were dim, some flickering, and the atmosphere felt darker than it should have been. That's when I noticed something. On the other side of the street, a person was standing. They weren't walking, just standing there in the shadow of an entrance. I looked ahead, trying to ignore it, but something about their posture was unsettling. It wasn't like someone waiting for a taxi or checking their phone. It was more rigid. I kept walking, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. I glanced back over my shoulder, and the figure was still there, but now they had taken a few steps in my direction. My heart raced. I knew I should stay calm, but the idea of being alone on the deserted street began to terrify me. I quickened my pace, trying to reach a more illuminated intersection, but before I got there, I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't hurried, but matched my pace, as if they wanted me to know they were there. I turned to look, but the street was empty. There was no one. I stood still for a moment, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I heard something else. Not footsteps, but a heavy, irregular breathing coming from a nearby alley. I should have kept walking, but something compelled me to look into the alley. And that's when I saw him. A dark silhouette was at the back of the alley, leaning to the side as if having trouble standing. Its arms looked disproportionate, hanging in a strange way. "Do you need help?" My voice came out hesitant, almost a whisper. The figure moved but didn't respond. Slowly, it began to walk in my direction. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I ran down the street, trying to find any sign of movement or anyone, but the city seemed to have turned into a desert. As I ran, the footsteps behind me resumed, now faster, echoing off the walls of the buildings. The sound seemed to get closer with every second, but I didn't have the courage to look back. Finally, I turned a corner and saw a taxi parked. I ran to it, shouting at the driver. He looked at me with a mix of confusion and collapse, as if I were the first person he'd seen in hours. I got into the car, locking the door behind me. "Just drive," I said, breathless. The driver began to move, but before the taxi accelerated, he looked out the window. The figure was standing on the corner, staring directly at me. Even from a distance, I could see that its face was strange, not deformed, but empty, as if it had no real expression. I arrived at my hotel in silence, still trying to process what had happened. I didn't say anything, but when the driver got out of the car, he said something that still sends chills down my spine. "You were lucky. Those streets, they're not meant for wandering alone." I never walked in New York at night again. Even now, months later, I feel chills every time I think of that figure. Some places, even in a city as alive as New York, seem to exist outside our world. Report 3. It was my first time in New York. I'd always imagined the city as a place where nothing bad could happen with so many people around, where the lights shone until dawn and the constant movement made you never feel alone. That night, I learned the hard way that isolation can find you even in the heart of a city that never sleeps. I had just arrived in the city for a conference and decided to take advantage of my free time by exploring the streets at night. My idea was to walk around Manhattan, maybe grab something to eat, and then head back to the hotel. The walk started off calm, with tourists and locals mingling on the sidewalks. The lit storefronts gave a special glow to the night, and I felt completely safe. However, as I moved forward, the number of people began to dwindle. I didn't notice at first, but suddenly I was alone on a narrow street, surrounded by old buildings and with sparse lighting. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The GPS on my phone told me I was still on the right path, but something in the atmosphere had changed. The silence there felt out of place, as if the city had decided for a moment to hold its breath. As I walked, I heard a sound. It was subtle, like a faint crack followed by the noise of something being dragged. I looked back, but saw nothing. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. A few more steps, and I heard it again. This time it seemed closer, as if someone was stepping on the bits of trash that had accumulated along the sidewalk. I quickly turned around, shining my phone's flashlight down the path. The street was empty, but something seemed to move in the shadows. "Is anyone there?" My voice came out hesitant, breaking the silence in a nearly awkward way. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps echoing from afar. I quickened my pace, trying to find a busier avenue, but the more I walked, the more the streets became deserted. It was then that I saw him. Across the street, a figure stood under a streetlight. It was a man with an ordinary appearance, but something in the way he looked at me made me uncomfortable. He didn't move, just watched me, motionless. I tried not to stare for too long, but when I looked forward again, he was crossing the street. Not running, but walking firmly, as if he had a purpose. I felt my heart race. I decided to turn at the next corner, hoping to shake him off, but when I looked back, he was still there. I stopped in front of a store with its lights off and pretended to fiddle with my phone, hoping he would walk past. However, he stopped on the other side of the street, leaning against a pole. The situation was clear. He was following me. Not knowing what to do, I kept walking. I turned at another corner, then another, trying to find a way out, but the streets were obvious mazes. The few people around were too far away to hear if I called for help. As I walked, I began to hear footsteps again. They weren't fast, but they were there, echoing on the sidewalk behind me. When I looked back, he was closer. What was only unsettling before now felt like a real threat. His posture had changed. He leaned his head slightly, as if teasing me, and his steps were deliberately slow, as if he wanted to prolong my fear. I tried to cross the street to gain distance, but then I heard a whistle, low, almost casual, but enough to freeze me. When I turned again, he was in the middle of the street, standing under another streetlight. The smile on his face was disturbing. Don't wait to see what he would do next. Run. I didn't care about the direction, I just wanted to get out of there. Finally, I reached a busy avenue filled with taxis and people coming out of bars. I looked back one last time, but he had disappeared. I returned to the hotel and locked the door, feeling my heart pound like a drum. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, looking out the window, waiting to see him again. I never walked alone in New York at night again. Some streets, even in the brightest city in the world, hold secrets that are better left undiscovered.